The orphan donates blanket to Shivering woman. Later learns she's his long-lost grandmother. The thought never crossed Elijah's mind as he wrapped his only blanket around the elderly woman's trembling shoulders on that bitter December night. Some decisions in life don't require thought. They come straight from whatever remains of a heart after it's been broken too many times to count. At 17, Elijah Walker had mastered the art of invisible living at Pinecrest Group Home. He moved through the hallways like a shadow, shoulders hunched beneath the weight of a childhood spent being passed from one temporary home to another. His dark eyes, too old for his youthful face, had learned to see without being seen, to absorb the world without engaging with it. Tonight, as winter's first serious snowfall transformed the city into something almost beautiful, Elijah stood at the window of his shared bedroom. The other boys had left for a supervised outing to the movies, a reward for good behavior that Elijah had sacrificed after speaking back to Mr. Dennison, the home's strictest supervisor. The punishment felt hollow. Elijah preferred solitude anyway. His breath fogged the glass as he traced patterns with his fingertip, watching snowflakes drift through the glow of streetlights. That's when he noticed her, a small figure huddled on a bench across the street. An elderly woman, clearly underdressed for the weather, clutching a plastic shopping bag to her chest like it contained treasures rather than what Elijah suspected were her only possessions. Something about her stillness bothered him. The way she didn't fidget or attempt to warm herself spoke of resignation rather than patience. Elijah knew that posture intimately, the conservation of energy when you're down to your last reserves. Not your problem, he whispered to himself. The mantra of survival he'd adopted after his 8th foster placement fell through. Caring hurt. Caring was dangerous. But his eyes kept returning to the woman. Her silver hair caught the streetlight, creating a halo effect that reminded him of something he couldn't quite place. A fragment of memory just beyond his reach. The digital clock on the nightstand clicked over to 8:17 p.m. Staff would be checking rooms at 10 o'clock. No one would notice if he slipped out and back in before then. Elijah's worn backpack contained everything that mattered to him. A dog-eared copy of The Hobbit, a Swiss Army knife given to him by the only foster father who'd ever treated him with respect, a faded photograph of a woman he'd been told was his mother, and the wool blanket that had been with him since his earliest memories at the county children's shelter. The blanket, soft gray with blue trim, was the only constant in his 17 years of existence. He slept with it every night, even now when the other boys might have teased him if they knew. Its familiar weight was security. It sent a strange comfort he couldn't explain. Some buried part of him felt certain it had been his before the system, before becoming a case number, before Orphan became his primary identity. Standing at the window, watching the woman's shoulders shake with cold, Elijah made a decision that defied logical explanation. He pulled the blanket from his bed, folded it carefully, and tucked it under his jacket. The bitter cold hit him like a physical blow as he slipped out the service entrance that the older boys used for their cigarette breaks. His breath crystallized in front of him as he crossed the street, each step crunching in fresh snow. The woman didn't look up as he approached, her gaze fixed on some middle distance only she could see. Up close, Elijah could see the fine lines etched into her face, like a map of a difficult journey. Her hands, red and chapped, clutched her thin coat closed at the neck. Despite the cold turning her lips slightly blue, there was a dignity in her posture that spoke of someone who had once stood taller. "Excuse me," Elijah said, his voice cracking slightly. "I thought you might need this." He pulled the blanket from beneath his jacket, already missing its warmth. For a moment, the woman didn't react, and Elijah wondered if she might be too disoriented from the cold to understand. Then she looked up. Her eyes were a startling shade of amber, almost golden in the streetlight. Something lurched in Elijah's chest, a recognition he couldn't possibly feel for a stranger. Those eyes seemed to look through him, past his carefully constructed walls, to something underneath he rarely acknowledged himself. "I can't take your blanket, young man," she said, her voice surprisingly clear and melodic, though her teeth chattered between words. "You'll freeze yourself." "I'm going back inside." Elijah nodded toward the group home. "I don't need it." "Please." He held the blanket out again, and after a moment's hesitation, she reached for it with trembling fingers. As the fabric passed between them, something inexplicable happened. A jolt, like static electricity, but warmer, more significant. The woman unfolded the blanket, and as she did, her movements suddenly stilled. Her fingers traced the blue trim with such focused attention that Elijah shifted uncomfortably. "This blanket, She whispered more to herself than to him. Where did you get this blanket? Elijah shrugged, suddenly defensive. I've always had it. Her eyes, wet now with what might have been tears or simply the cold, studied his face with an intensity that made him want to step back. What's your name? She asked. Elijah. He didn't offer his last name, a habit born from years in the system. Elijah, she repeated as though testing the sound of it. Thank you for your kindness. My name is Margaret. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and Elijah felt a strange mixture of loss and satisfaction watching his most treasured possession envelop this stranger. The blue trim framed her face, and for a moment, something about the image tugged at his memory, like a dream he'd forgotten upon waking. You should go somewhere warm, Elijah said, suddenly awkward. There's a shelter 3 blocks east that still might have beds. Margaret nodded but made no move to rise. Sometimes a moment of kindness provides more warmth than any shelter, Elijah. The way she said his name, with a gentle emphasis on the first syllable, sent another ripple of that strange recognition through him. He took a step back, suddenly anxious to return to the safety of his well-defined isolation. Keep the blanket, he said, then added impulsively, I'm usually at the park 2 blocks north on Saturdays, by the chess tables. He wasn't sure why he volunteered this information. He never went to the chess tables. Yet as he said it, he knew he would be there the coming weekend. Margaret smiled, transforming her weathered face into something luminous. Perhaps I'll see you there then. Elijah nodded once, then turned and hurried back across the street, the cold seeping through his jacket now without the blanket's added protection. As he reached the group home door, he glanced back. Margaret was standing now, the blanket secured around her shoulders, watching him with an unreadable expression. She raised one hand in a small wave, and Elijah found himself returning the gesture before slipping back inside. That night, for the first time in his memory, Elijah slept without his blanket. He dreamed of golden eyes and a woman's voice singing a lullaby he almost remembered. Saturday arrived with knife-edge clarity, the sky a brittle blue that promised cold without the previous week's snowfall. Elijah hadn't planned to actually go to the chess tables. Impulsive promises to strangers weren't meant to be kept. Yet after breakfast, he found himself pulling on his jacket and telling Mrs. Hernandez, the weekend supervisor, that he was going for a walk. The park was nearly empty, too cold for casual visitors. A few dedicated joggers circled the paths, their breath-forming clouds that trailed behind them like thought bubbles in comics. The chess tables stood vacant, their stone surfaces dusted with frost. Elijah sat at one, not really expecting Margaret to appear. He told himself he'd come only because the group home felt particularly stifling today, with Jackson and Trey arguing about a missing video game controller and Mr. Dennison in one of his inspection moods. He was about to leave when he spotted her, not approaching from the park entrance as he'd expected, but already seated at a table nearby, his gray blanket now fashioned into a makeshift shawl over a clean, though dated coat. You came, Margaret said simply, as though continuing a conversation they'd been having all along. Elijah nodded, shoving his hands deeper into his pockets as he approached her table. Up close in daylight, Margaret looked different, still weathered by hardship but more put together than the desperate woman he'd encountered on the bench. Her silver hair was neatly combed, and though her clothes were worn, they were clean. I wasn't sure you would, he admitted, taking the stone seat across from her. The chessboard between them was missing most of its pieces. Only a white queen and a few pawns remained. I've learned to keep promises, Margaret said. Even the small ones. She adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. Especially to someone who would give away something so precious. Elijah's eyes fixed on the blanket. It's just an old blanket. Is it? Margaret's amber eyes held his. You've had it a long time, I think. For as long as I can remember, Elijah admitted, surprised at his own willingness to share even this small detail. Margaret nodded, as though he'd confirmed something important. Sometimes objects carry memories even when our minds have let them go. Her fingers stroked the blue trim with what seemed like reverence. This blanket was hand-knitted. Did you know that? Elijah hadn't known, had never considered the blanket's origins. It had simply always been. My daughter learned to knit when she was expecting her baby. Margaret continued, her voice taking on a faraway quality. She was never particularly patient with crafts, but for her child, she stopped, something flashing across her face that Elijah couldn't interpret. You have children? He asked, unsure why he was prolonging this strange conversation. I had a daughter, Margaret said softly. Rebecca. I lost her 13 years ago. I'm sorry. Elijah offered automatically, the phrase empty from overuse but sincerely meant. And you? Margaret asked. Where is your family, Elijah? The question should have felt invasive. It was the first thing people always wanted to know, their eyes filling with that mixture of pity and discomfort when he told them. Yet from Margaret, it felt different somehow. Genuine. I don't have one, he said simply. I've been in the system since I was 4. Margaret's hands stilled on the blanket. And before that? Elijah shrugged. I don't remember much. There was an accident, I think. My parents died. He recited these facts with practiced detachment. They were data points in a file, not emotional touchstones. That must have been very difficult, Margaret said. And unlike the social workers and teachers who'd spoken similar words over the years, her voice held no professional distance, only genuine sorrow. It's fine. I don't remember them. The lie came automatically, though fragments did sometimes surface. A woman's laugh, the smell of cinnamon, strong arms lifting him toward a ceiling fan he'd been fascinated by. But these weren't memories so much as impressions, unreliable and possibly imagined. Memory is a strange thing, Margaret said as though reading his thoughts. What we keep and what we lose isn't always in our control. A gust of wind swept through the park, and Margaret pulled the blanket tighter. The movement reminded Elijah why they were there in the first place. Did you find somewhere to stay? He asked. After the other night? Margaret nodded. I have a room now. It's small, but it's warm. She hesitated, then added, I wasn't always without a home, Elijah. Life takes unexpected turns sometimes. There was something in her tone that made Elijah want to know more, though asking personal questions wasn't his habit. Before he could decide whether to inquire further, Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out a thermos. I brought hot chocolate, she said. Would you like some? The normality of the offer, something a grandmother might do for a grandson on a cold day at the park, created a lump in Elijah's throat he couldn't explain. He nodded, watching as she poured steaming chocolate into the thermos cap and handed it to him. The first sip spread warmth through his chest. It wasn't the powdered mix served sometimes at the group home, but real chocolate, rich and not too sweet. Another fragment of memory stirred, sitting at a kitchen table, small legs swinging, a similar taste on his tongue. It's good, he said inadequately. Margaret smiled, pouring a cup for herself. My grandmother's recipe. Some traditions are worth preserving. They sat in companionable silence, sipping hot chocolate as the winter sun created long shadows across the chess tables. Elijah couldn't remember the last time he'd sat quietly with someone without feeling the need to escape. There was something about Margaret that felt safe. Do you play? She gestured to the depleted chessboard between them. Not really, Elijah admitted. One of the homes I stayed in had a set, but no one would teach me. I could, Margaret offered. If you'd like to learn. Elijah studied her face, looking for the hidden agenda, the unspoken expectation that always seemed to accompany offers from adults. He found only a simple invitation in her golden eyes. Maybe, he said, which was more openness than he usually allowed himself. By the time they'd finished the hot chocolate, Elijah had learned the basic moves of each chess piece and completed a simplified game that Margaret let him win in a way that preserved his dignity. The afternoon had slipped away, and he realized he needed to return to the group home before dinner check-in. I should go, he said, standing reluctantly. Margaret nodded, gathering the thermos and cups. It was a pleasure spending time with you, Elijah. Yeah, he said, surprised to find he meant it. It was nice. As he turned to leave, Margaret called after him. Will you come again next Saturday? Elijah hesitated only briefly. Same time? Margaret's smile crinkled the corners of her eyes. I'll bring a proper chess set. The winter weeks fell into an unexpected pattern. Every Saturday, weather permitting, Elijah would meet Margaret at the chess tables. She always brought something: hot chocolate, homemade cookies, once even a carefully wrapped sandwich that tasted better than anything from the group home's institutional kitchen. Elijah found himself looking forward to these meetings with an eagerness that both confused and alarmed him. Attachment was dangerous. He'd learned that lesson through years of disrupted placements and broken promises. Yet there was something about Margaret that bypassed his carefully constructed defenses. They played chess, Margaret patiently teaching him strategies and gently pointing out alternatives when he made impulsive moves. Sometimes they just talked. Margaret never pressed when Elijah deflected personal questions, but over time, he found himself volunteering small details about his life. His interest in astronomy, his struggle with algebra, his hope to find a job when he aged out of the system in less than a year. Margaret shared stories too, though Elijah noticed she spoke mostly of the distant past. Her childhood in a small coastal town, her years teaching elementary school, her passion for classical music. When he asked about more recent years, she would skillfully redirect the conversation. It was during their 5th Saturday meeting that Elijah finally asked the question that had been nagging at him. "The night we met," he began, moving his knight to capture one of her pawns. "Why were you out there in the snow?" Margaret's fingers stilled on her bishop. For a moment, Elijah thought she might not answer. "I was looking for someone," she finally said, her voice soft but steady. "I've been looking for a very long time." "Did you find them?" Elijah asked. Margaret's amber eyes met his, and that strange sense of recognition flickered through him again. "I believe I might have," she said cryptically, then moved her bishop to put his king in check. Their meetings continued through January and into February. Elijah brought Margaret a birthday card when she mentioned turning 68. Nothing fancy, just a simple card he'd bought with his meager allowance. Her eyes had filled with tears when she opened it, and she'd held it against her heart as though he'd given her something precious. One Saturday in late February, Margaret didn't come. Elijah waited at the chess tables for 2 hours, the cold seeping through his jacket as the afternoon light faded. Worry, an emotion he rarely allowed himself, gnawed at his stomach. Margaret had never missed a meeting, had never been even 5 minutes late. He had no way to contact her, he realized. In all their conversations, they'd never exchanged phone numbers or addresses. Margaret existed for him only in the context of these Saturday afternoons. And now she was simply gone. The following week, he returned to the park, telling himself he was stupid to hope. People disappeared from his life. That was the natural order of things. Attachment led to disappointment. He'd been foolish to forget that fundamental truth. Yet as he approached the chess tables, his heart leapt at the sight of silver hair. Margaret sat at their usual table, but something was different. Her posture lacked its usual dignity, her shoulders hunched forward as though bearing an invisible weight. "Margaret?" Elijah hurried the last few steps. She looked up, and the change in her face stopped him cold. Her cheeks were hollowed, her skin ashen. Dark circles underscored her amber eyes, which brightened only slightly at the sight of him. "Elijah," she said, and even her voice sounded thinner. "I'm sorry about last week." He sat across from her, chest forgotten. "Are you okay? You look—" He stopped, not wanting to be unkind. "Unwell?" She smiled faintly. "Yes, I've had a difficult couple of weeks." "What happened?" Margaret sighed, adjusting the familiar gray blanket that still served as her shawl. "Age happens, dear boy, and bodies sometimes betray us." A chill that had nothing to do with the February air settled over Elijah. "Are you sick?" The directness of his question seemed to surprise her, but after a moment, she nodded. "My heart isn't what it used to be. I've known for some time, but recently it's become more insistent about its limitations." Elijah's own heart seemed to stutter in his chest. "Have you seen a doctor?" "When I can," Margaret said, with the pragmatism of someone who had made peace with difficult circumstances. "But let's not waste our afternoon on dreary topics. I've brought a new chess set, look." She pulled out a small magnetic travel chess set. "I thought perhaps you might keep this at your residence for practice." The gift, the first he'd received in years that wasn't a donated Christmas charity item, left Elijah momentarily speechless. He reached for the set with careful hands. "Thank you," he managed finally. "But I'd rather play with you." Margaret's smile warmed her tired face. "And we shall. But an old woman's company can't be your only entertainment." "You're not that old," Elijah said automatically, though the evidence before him suggested otherwise. Margaret laughed, a sound that transformed her face back into something closer to the woman he'd come to know. "Flattery will get you everywhere, young man." They played chess that afternoon, but Elijah's heart wasn't in the game. His eyes kept returning to Margaret's face, noting the tremor in her hands, the way she occasionally pressed her palm against her chest as though calming something restless within. As they prepared to part, Elijah made a decision. "I want your phone number," he said with the directness that sometimes got him in trouble at the group home. "Or address, or both." Margaret tilted her head. "Why is that, Elijah?" "Because—" He struggled to articulate feelings he wasn't accustomed to examining. "Because I want to know you're okay." Between Saturdays, something softened in Margaret's expression. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to impose—" "It's not an imposition," Elijah interrupted, surprising himself with his vehemence. It's what friends do. They check on each other." The word friends hung between them, a label Elijah rarely applied to anyone. Margaret seemed to understand the significance of it. Friends, she repeated softly. Yes, I suppose we are. She reached into her bag and extracted a small notepad and pencil, writing down a phone number with careful strokes. This is my current number. The service isn't always reliable, but messages eventually reach me. Elijah took the paper, folding it carefully before tucking it into his jacket pocket. I'll call. If you don't come next Saturday, I'll be here, Margaret promised, weather permitting. As they parted, Elijah felt a strange reluctance to leave her, as though something important remained unsaid between them. He watched her walk slowly toward the park exit, the gray blanket with its blue trim wrapped around shoulders that seemed to have carried invisible burdens for too long. That night, he dreamed of the blanket, of small hands clutching its soft folds, of a woman's voice singing about moonlight and promises, of safety and belonging. He woke with tears on his cheeks, a sensation so unfamiliar that he touched them in wonder, trying to understand what his dreaming mind had been mourning. Margaret kept her promise the following Saturday, though she arrived later than usual and seemed out of breath from the short walk from the park entrance to the chess tables. As they played, Elijah noticed her wincing occasionally, her hand straying to her chest in a now familiar gesture. You should see a doctor, he said bluntly as she reset the board after his rare victory. Doctors cost money, Elijah, Margaret replied with simple pragmatism, and they rarely tell you anything you don't already know. But if your heart is... My heart has been breaking and mending for decades, she interrupted gently. Its current complaints are just the latest chapter in a long conversation. Elijah frowned, moving his pawn with more force than necessary. That's a poetic way of saying you're ignoring a serious problem. Margaret's laugh held genuine delight. My aren't we direct today? Her expression softened at his scowl. I appreciate your concern, truly, but some things are beyond fixing. That's not true, Elijah insisted, though his experience suggested otherwise. Nothing in his life had ever been truly fixed, only temporarily patched until the next inevitable breakdown. Margaret studied him with those amber eyes that sometimes seemed to see straight through to his core. Perhaps you're right, she conceded, but today is too lovely to spend worrying about tomorrows that may never arrive. The spring-like warmth of the day belied the February date, and Margaret suggested they move from the chess tables to a sunny bench overlooking the small pond at the park center. As they sat, a comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the distant laughter of children at the playground and the occasional splashing of ducks in the water. Elijah, Margaret said finally, may I ask you something personal? He tensed slightly. Their unspoken agreement had always been to avoid probing too deeply into painful territory, but nodded. Your earliest memory, she said carefully. What is it? Elijah's instinct was to deflect, to offer the sanitized version he'd constructed for social workers and therapists over the years. But Margaret's question felt different. Not clinical curiosity, but something more meaningful. It's not really clear, he admitted. More like impressions than actual memories. A yellow kitchen, someone singing, the smell of something baking. He paused, then added the detail he usually kept to himself. And a mobile over my crib, with stars and planets. When the window was open, it would spin and the light would make patterns on the ceiling. Margaret's breath caught audibly, but when Elijah glanced at her, her expression was carefully neutral. That sounds like a peaceful memory. I think it was, Elijah said. Before the accident, Margaret repeated softly. What do you know about it? Elijah shrugged. Not much. There was a car crash. My parents died. I was found in the back seat, mostly unhurt except for... He touched the small scar near his hairline, barely visible now. I don't remember any of it. And after? Who took care of you? I was in the hospital for a while, then foster care. The usual story. He tried to keep his tone matter-of-fact, though something about Margaret's intense focus made him uncomfortable. Why do you want to know all this? Margaret looked out over the water, her profile sharp against the afternoon light. Because our past shape us, even the parts we can't remember. She turned to face him fully. And because sometimes, Elijah, life offers second chances in the most unexpected ways. There was something in her voice, a weight, an intention, that sent a strange shiver through him. What do you mean? Before she could answer, a fit of coughing overtook her. Deep, racking coughs that bent her forward. Elijah watched in alarm as she pressed her hand against her chest, her face contorting in pain. Margaret? He reached for her shoulder, unsure how to help. The coughing subsided gradually, leaving her breathing in shallow gasps. I'm sorry, she managed after a moment. Perhaps we should cut our visit short today. Let me help you home, Elijah said immediately. Margaret shook her head. That's not necessary. It is, he insisted with a firmness that surprised them both. I'm not letting you walk home alone like this. Something in his tone must have convinced her, because after a moment's consideration, she nodded. Very well. It's not far. Far proved to be relative. What might have been a short walk for a healthy person took nearly 30 minutes as Margaret moved slowly, stopping frequently to rest. Elijah adjusted his pace to hers, offering his arm for support, which she eventually accepted with a mixture of gratitude and what seemed like embarrassment. The neighborhood they entered was neither as rundown as Elijah had feared, nor as stable as he had hoped. Margaret led him to a modest apartment building with a faded exterior but clean, well-lit hallways. Her apartment was on the second floor, a challenge that left her leaning heavily on both Elijah and the railing as they ascended. Inside, the small one-bedroom apartment was meticulously neat but sparsely furnished. A second-hand couch, a small dining table with two mismatched chairs, bookshelves made of cinder blocks and boards. What struck Elijah most were the books that filled every available surface and the framed photographs that covered one wall entirely. As Margaret settled onto the couch, catching her breath, Elijah found himself drawn to the photo wall. Most showed a younger Margaret with a dark-haired woman who shared her amber eyes, her daughter Rebecca, he presumed. In some photos, Rebecca held a baby, a small boy with serious eyes who seemed to study the camera with unusual intensity. Is this your grandson? Elijah asked, pointing to one photo where the boy, perhaps 3 years old, sat on a porch step clutching a familiar gray blanket with blue trim. Margaret had been watching him closely as he examined the photos. Now she nodded, her expression unreadable. Yes, that's my grandson, Elijah. The name hit him like a physical blow. He turned to stare at her, suddenly understanding the strange sense of recognition that had haunted their encounters. The way she sometimes looked at him, as though searching for someone else in his features. Your grandson's name is Elijah? His voice sounded distant to his own ears. Margaret nodded again, her amber eyes so like his own, never leaving his face. Elijah Thomas Walker, born April 17th, 14 years before the day we met at the park. Elijah felt the room tilt slightly. His birthday, his full name. That's my name. Yes, Margaret said simply. It is. The implications crashed over him in waves. But that would mean he couldn't finish the thought, couldn't give voice to the possibility that seemed simultaneously impossible and inevitable. That I'm your grandmother, Margaret finished for him, her voice steady despite the tears now filling her eyes. And that I've been looking for you since the day they told me you had died alongside my daughter and her husband. Elijah's legs suddenly couldn't support him. He sank into the nearest chair, his mind racing to process this revelation. They told you I died? Who told you that? The authorities? Margaret said, the words clearly painful to speak. There was a car accident. You know this part. What you don't know is that your parents' car went off a bridge. By the time emergency services arrived, they could only recover... She stopped, composing herself. They recovered your parents' bodies. The car had been partially submerged. They believed you had been swept away by the current, but I wasn't. Elijah said, stating the obvious to anchor himself in this shifting reality. No, Margaret agreed. Somehow you survived. Perhaps someone found you before the authorities arrived. Perhaps, I don't know. I've imagined 1,000 scenarios over the years. What matters is that while I was planning a funeral for my entire family, you were alive, entering the foster system under your own name, a name no one connected to the accident because the records were mishandled. How did you find out? Elijah asked, still struggling to process that this woman, this stranger who had become so important to him over the past months, might be his only living relative. I never stopped looking, Margaret said simply. Even after the funeral, I couldn't accept that you were gone. I hired private investigators when I could afford them. I followed every lead, no matter how tenuous. Her voice softened, and then I lost everything, my home, my savings, still searching. Some called it an obsession. Perhaps it was. She leaned forward, her expression intense. And then on the coldest night of December, a young man gave me his blanket, a gray blanket with blue trim that I watched my daughter knit while waiting for her son to be born. Elijah's eyes dropped to the blanket still wrapped around Margaret's shoulders. His blanket, his grandmother's blanket, the only constant in his life, connecting him to a past he couldn't remember, but had somehow always carried with him. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, a surge of anger cutting through his confusion. That first day at the chess tables. Why play games for weeks when you knew? I wasn't certain, Margaret said gently. The blanket made me hope, but I needed to be sure. And I was afraid of what? That you wouldn't believe me, that you would run, that after 13 years of searching, I would lose you again before I had a chance to know you. Her voice broke slightly. I needed you to trust me first, Elijah. To know me as a person before you had to accept me as family. The logic of it struck Elijah silent. Wouldn't he have run if a homeless woman had claimed to be his grandmother that first night? Wouldn't he have dismissed her as confused or manipulative? I don't know what to believe, he said finally, his voice small in the quiet apartment. Margaret nodded, understanding in her eyes. I have documents, birth certificates, photographs, even your medical records from when you were small. But I don't expect you to believe me immediately, Elijah. Truth this big takes time to absorb. She rose slowly from the couch, moving to a small secretary desk in the corner. From a drawer, she extracted a folder and returned, placing it on the coffee table between them. When you're ready, this contains everything I've saved, everything I could prove. She sat again, visibly tired from even this small exertion. But for now, perhaps you'd like some time to think. This is a lot to process at once. Elijah stared at the folder, feeling as though it contained explosives rather than paper. Inside might be answers to questions he'd stopped asking years ago, or elaborate fabrications from a lonely woman desperate for connection. The possibility of either seemed equally terrifying. I should go, he said abruptly, standing. It's almost curfew at the home. If Margaret was hurt by his retreat, she didn't show it. She simply nodded. Of course. Perhaps next Saturday. I don't know. Elijah cut her off, unable to make promises while his world was realigning itself around this new possibility. I need to think. I understand, Margaret said softly. The folder will be here when you're ready. As will I. As Elijah reached the door, he paused, one question burning through his confusion. If you're really my grandmother, why did no one find you after the accident? Why wasn't I placed with you instead of in foster care? Margaret's smile held infinite sadness. Because your mother and I had a falling out, Elijah. We hadn't spoken in nearly a year before the accident. My name wasn't in her current records. By the time I learned what had happened, you were already lost in the system. The honesty of her answer, admitting to a familial rift rather than constructing a neater narrative, struck Elijah as significant. Fabrications typically painted more perfect pictures. What did you argue about? He asked, not sure why this detail mattered yet, feeling it somehow did. Her choice of husband, Margaret said simply. I was wrong and too proud to admit it until it was too late. Jonathan was a good man who made my daughter very happy. My disapproval cost me precious time with all of you. Her eyes held his, a mistake I've regretted every day since. The raw pain in her voice resonated with something deep in Elijah's chest, a recognition of genuine grief that no performance could replicate. Still, he needed space to process, to think clearly away from the emotional pull of Margaret's presence. I'll see you, he said, neither a promise nor a goodbye, and slipped out the door before she could respond. The walk back to the group home passed in a blur, his mind cycling through the implications of Margaret's claim. If true, it meant he wasn't alone in the world. It meant the system that had shuffled him from home to home for 13 years had failed in the most fundamental way, never connecting him to family that had been searching for him all along. It meant his identity, carefully constructed around the certainty of his orphan status, was built on a misunderstanding. Back in his room, Elijah lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, his hand unconsciously searching for the comfort of a blanket that was no longer there, but now carried more meaning than he'd ever imagined possible. Elijah didn't go to the chess tables the following Saturday, nor the Saturday after that. He threw himself into schoolwork, volunteered for extra chores at the group home, anything to keep his mind occupied and away from the questions that plagued his quiet moments. The phone number Margaret had given him burned in his pocket like a hot coal. Several times he found himself standing at the group home's shared phone, fingers hovering over the keypad, unable to complete the call. What stopped him wasn't disbelief, he realized eventually. It was fear. Fear that it might be true, and fear of what that truth would mean for his carefully managed expectations of life. Hope was dangerous. Family was dangerous. Both had the power to destroy the protective walls he'd built around himself. On the third Saturday of his self-imposed isolation, Mrs. Hernandez, the weekend supervisor, approached him as he aggressively vacuumed the common room. Elijah, there's someone here to see you. His heart leapt to his throat. Who is it? She says she's your grandmother. Mrs. Hernandez said, her expression concerned. Margaret Walker. Should I tell her you're not available? The choice crystallized before him. Continue hiding or face whatever truth awaited. Elijah switched off the vacuum. "No," he said. "I'll see her." Margaret waited in the small visitor's room, looking frailer than when he'd last seen her, but somehow more dignified. She wore a simple dress rather than her usual layers of weathered clothing, her silver hair neatly pinned back. On her lap rested the folder he'd left behind, and beside her on the institutional couch, the gray blanket with blue trim. She stood when he entered, her amber eyes, his eyes searching his face anxiously. "Elijah, thank you for seeing me." He remained by the door, maintaining a physical distance that mirrored his emotional uncertainty. "How did you find this place?" "Your file," Margaret said simply, gesturing to the folder. "Once I knew your full name, accessing your placement records wasn't difficult. I have a friend who still works in the system." Elijah moved further into the room, taking the chair across from her. Why are you here?" Margaret sat again, her movements careful, deliberate. "Because you deserve answers, whether or not you're ready to hear them. And because..." She paused, pressing her hand briefly to her chest in that now familiar gesture. "Because time may be shorter than I'd hoped." The implication sent a chill through him. "Your heart?" She nodded. "It's growing more insistent about its limitations." A small smile softened the statement. "But we needn't focus on that today." Elijah's eyes dropped to the folder. "What's in there?" "Really?" "Evidence," Margaret said. "Birth certificates, yours, your mother's. Family photographs. Medical records. Articles about the accident." She touched the blanket beside her. "And the story of this, how it connects us." After a moment's hesitation, Elijah extended his hand. "May I see?" Margaret passed him the folder, her expression carefully neutral as he opened it. The first document was a birth certificate, his birth certificate. Elijah Thomas Walker, born to Rebecca Lynn Walker and Jonathan James Walker on April 17th, 17 years ago. Mother's place of birth, Oak Ridge, Michigan. Father's place of birth, Columbus, Ohio. Details he'd never known about himself, laid out in official black and white. Next came photographs. Margaret holding a newborn, her face younger but unmistakable. The same baby in the arms of a dark-haired woman with Margaret's amber eyes. A family portrait. The woman, a tall man with Elijah's jawline, and a toddler sitting on a porch step. Elijah felt a strange vertigo as he studied the toddler's face. His face, yet not quite his, captured in a moment he couldn't remember living. "This is me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Yes," Margaret said softly. "Your third birthday. The last one we celebrated together before..." She stopped, visibly composing herself. "Before I let my pride cost us our relationship." Elijah continued through the documents. Medical records showing childhood vaccinations, a newspaper clipping about the accident that claimed 2 lives but mentioned nothing about a child, legal documents from Margaret's years-long search. At the bottom of the stack, he found a handwritten letter on faded blue paper. "What's this?" he asked, unfolding it carefully. "The last letter your mother wrote to me," Margaret said. "She never sent it. It was found in her desk after the accident." Her voice thickened. "In it, she was reaching out to reconcile. She wanted me to be part of your life again." Elijah read the letter slowly, his throat tightening at the words of a woman he couldn't remember. "Mom, it's been too long, and life is too short for this silence between us. Jonathan and I are planning a trip your way next month, and we want you to meet Elijah again. He's grown so much, and he asks about his grandmother. Whatever our disagreements, they shouldn't keep you from knowing your grandson or him from knowing you. He still sleeps with the blanket you helped me make for him. Sometimes I think he remembers you, though he was so young when we last visited. It's time to heal this rift between us. Family is too precious to waste on pride, yours or mine. With love, Becky." Elijah looked up from the letter to find Margaret watching him, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "They were coming to see you," he said, the pieces falling into place. "The accident, they were on their way to me," Margaret confirmed. "If I hadn't been so stubborn for so long, if I had reached out sooner..." "It wasn't your fault," Elijah said automatically, surprised by his own certainty on this point. Margaret wiped her tears with a tissue from her pocket. "Perhaps not directly, but regret doesn't always follow logical lines, Elijah." He returned to the folder, examining each document again with greater attention. The evidence was compelling, consistent, and deeply personal in ways that would be difficult to fabricate. The Margaret Walker in these records aligned perfectly with the woman sitting across from him, from her birth date to her former profession as an elementary school teacher. And then there was the blanket, the physical link between the toddler in the photographs and the teenager he'd become. "I think I believe you," he said finally, the words emerging before he'd fully decided to speak them. Margaret's inhale was sharp, hopeful. "You do? It makes sense," Elijah said slowly. "More sense than anything else ever has about my life." He gestured to the documents. "And there's too much here that fits together. Things you couldn't have known or guessed." "Oh, Elijah." Margaret's voice broke on his name. "I've waited so long to hear you say that." The emotion in her voice triggered something in him, a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. "If you're my grandmother and you found me now, what happens next?" Margaret straightened slightly, regaining her composure. "That depends on what you want, Elijah. You're 17, nearly an adult in the eyes of the law. I can petition for guardianship until your birthday, if that's what you want. Or," she hesitated, "or we can simply get to know each other without legal entanglements. The choice is yours." The offer of choice, genuine choice with no pressure or expectation, struck Elijah deeply. All his life, decisions had been made for him, his path determined by caseworkers and court orders, and the availability of foster placements. "I don't know what I want yet," he admitted. "This is all a lot." "Of course it is," Margaret agreed. "There's no rush, Elijah. We have time." But the hand that briefly pressed against her chest suggested otherwise, a gesture Elijah was learning to read with increasing concern. "Are you seeing doctors?" he asked abruptly. "For your heart," Margaret's smile was gentle. "Yes. When we last spoke, I took your concern to heart, if you'll forgive the pun. I've been to the county medical clinic twice. They're very kind there. And," Elijah pressed, "and they've confirmed what I already knew," Margaret said. "My heart is tired. They've given me medication that helps with the symptoms, but the underlying condition remains." "What condition?" Elijah found himself leaning forward, suddenly desperate for specifics. "Congestive heart failure," Margaret said with the same matter-of-fact tone she might use to discuss the weather. "Exacerbated by years of inadequate medical care, and perhaps by the stress of grief and searching." Elijah absorbed this information, his mind racing. "Can they fix it? Surgery or something? At my age, with my history? The risks outweigh the potential benefits." Margaret's expression softened at what must have been visible distress on his face. "Elijah, we all face mortality eventually. I've made peace with mine." "Well, I haven't," he said sharply, surprising them both with his vehemence. "I just found you. I'm not ready to lose you." The words hung between them, raw, honest, unplanned. In speaking them, Elijah realized they were true. Whatever barriers of caution and self-protection he'd constructed, Margaret had somehow slipped past them. "Oh, my dear boy." Margaret's eyes filled again. "I'm doing everything I can to stay with you as long as possible. That's a promise." She held out her hand across the space between them, an invitation rather than a demand. After a moment's hesitation, Elijah took it, feeling the papery softness of her skin, the slight tremor in her fingers. "I want to know you," he said quietly, "not just the evidence and the history. You, my grandmother." Margaret's smile transformed her tired face. "That's all I've ever wanted, Elijah. To know the young man my grandson has become." He squeezed her hand gently, feeling something shift within his chest. A piece of himself settling into place he hadn't known was adrift. "Maybe," he said carefully, "you could come for dinner sometime. Here at the home, they allow that for family." "Family," Margaret repeated, the word carrying weight and wonder. "Yes, I'd like that very much." As they sat together in the institutional visitors' room, grandmother and grandson, separated for 13 years by bureaucratic oversight and cruel chance, now reunited by an act of kindness on a cold December night, Elijah felt something he'd almost forgotten how to recognize: hope. Spring bloomed across the city, transforming bare branches into explosions of pink and white blossoms, coating sidewalks with drifting petals that reminded Elijah of snow in reverse. His world had transformed just as dramatically in the months since learning Margaret was his grandmother. Dinner at the group home had led to weekend visits at Margaret's apartment, which led to overnight stays, which led, with surprising speed and support from his social worker once the DNA test confirmed their relationship, to a petition for guardianship that was granted just 2 weeks before Elijah's 18th birthday. Moving into Margaret's small apartment felt both strange and oddly familiar, as though some part of him recognized the rhythm of her movements, the cadence of her voice reading in the evening, the smell of her chamomile tea steeping on the kitchen counter. They established routines together. Chess in the evenings, walks in the park when Margaret's strength permitted, cooking lessons where she taught him family recipes she feared might otherwise be lost. On his birthday, she baked the same cinnamon cake his mother had made for him as a child, and the taste unlocked a fragment of memory so vivid it left him momentarily speechless. But beneath their growing closeness ran an undercurrent of concern. Despite medication and more regular medical care, Margaret's condition continued to deteriorate. The walks grew shorter, the rest periods longer. Some days she couldn't leave the apartment at all, her breathing too labored, her fatigue too profound. Elijah found himself taking on more responsibilities: grocery shopping, cleaning, even learning to administer her medications when her hands shook too badly to manage the pill bottles. He deferred his college applications, though Margaret protested this decision. "Your future shouldn't be put on hold for me," she insisted one evening as they sat together on the small balcony, watching the sunset paint the city in gold and pink. "I'm not putting it on hold," Elijah countered. "I'm just choosing a different path for now. The community college has classes I can take while still being here. And next year," he left the sentence unfinished, unwilling to speak aloud what they both understood. There might not be a next year. For Margaret, she reached for his hand, her touch feather-light. "You've given me more joy in these past months than I dared hope for, Elijah. But I need to know you'll build a life beyond this apartment, beyond caring for an old woman with a failing heart." "You're not just an old woman," Elijah said fiercely. "You're my grandmother, my family." Margaret's smile held both joy and sorrow. "Yes, I am. And family supports each other's dreams, not just their needs." She squeezed his hand. "Promise me you'll apply for the spring semester. The university program you mentioned. Environmental science, wasn't it?" Elijah nodded reluctantly. "I'll think about it." "Do more than think." Margaret pressed gently. "Promise me." Something in her tone, an urgency beyond their usual conversations about his future, made Elijah study her face more carefully. "Has something changed? Did the doctor say something at your appointment yesterday?" Margaret looked out at the sunset, her profile etched in fading light. "Let's just say time feels more precious than ever." Cold fear washed through him. "Margaret, I've made arrangements," she continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The apartment is paid through the end of the year. There's an insurance policy, not large, but enough for your education if you're careful. And I've written everything down. Our family history, stories about your mother growing up, things I want you to know." "Stop," Elijah said, his voice cracking. "Just stop. I don't want to talk about this." Margaret turned to him, her amber eyes the eyes he saw in the mirror each morning, gentle but insistent. "We must, dear heart, because whether we speak of it or not, it's coming. And I need to know you'll be prepared." Tears burned behind Elijah's eyes. "I'm not ready. None of us ever are," Margaret said softly. "But you are stronger than you know, Elijah. You survived 13 years without family, building resilience most people never need to develop. You will survive this too." "I don't want to just survive anymore," Elijah admitted, the words tearing from somewhere deep inside him. "I want to live." "Even with you." "I just found you." Margaret reached up to touch his cheek, her palm cool against his skin. "And I found you. After 13 years of searching, I found my grandson. That miracle is enough for me, Elijah. Whatever time we have, it's already more than I dared hope for." They sat together as the sunset faded and stars appeared in the deepening blue sky, neither speaking, but both acutely aware of time's relentless passage. Elijah made a silent promise, not about college applications, but about making every remaining day count. The decline, when it accelerated, came with brutal swiftness. In early June, Margaret collapsed while watering the small herb garden on their balcony. The hospitalization that followed confirmed what they'd feared. Her heart was failing rapidly, her systems beginning to shut down despite maximum medical intervention. Elijah barely left her hospital room, sleeping in the uncomfortable visitor's chair, leaving only when forced to by well-meaning nurses who insisted he shower and eat. He brought chess pieces from home, setting up games they rarely finished as Margaret's lucidity ebbed and flowed with her medication schedule. On a warm evening in mid-June, during a rare moment of clarity, Margaret beckoned Elijah closer to her bed. "The blanket," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the beeping monitors. "In my closet. Top shelf. A box." "What about it?" Elijah asked, leaning in to hear her better. "Story. I need to tell you." Her words faded as fatigue overtook her again. Elijah waited until the next morning when a neighbor came to sit with Margaret, then rushed home to find the box she'd mentioned. It was small, wooden, tucked behind winter scarves on the closet's top shelf. Inside, he found the gray blanket with blue trim, carefully folded, along with an envelope addressed simply, "For Elijah." He returned to the hospital, the box tucked under his arm, to find Margaret awake and more alert than she'd been in days. Her smile when she saw him enter carrying the box transformed her thin face, momentarily erasing the illness that had hollowed her cheeks and darkened the skin beneath her eyes. "You found it," she said as he settled beside her bed. Elijah nodded, placing the box on her lap. "What's this about?" Margaret's fingers traced the blanket's blue trim, the gesture so familiar it made Elijah's chest ache. "I never told you the whole story of this blanket," she said. "It seemed too soon, and then..." She gestured weakly at the hospital room around them. "Time got away from me. Tell me now," Elijah encouraged, taking her free hand in his. Margaret nodded, gathering her strength. "When your mother told me she was pregnant with you, we were still close then. I taught her to knit, something I'd learned from my own grandmother." A small smile touched her lips. Rebecca was impatient, not really suited to the slow rhythm of knitting. "But for you, for her baby," she persevered. She stroked the blanket's soft wool. "We worked on it together during her pregnancy. Every stitch contains conversation, hopes for you, plans for your future. When she struggled with a difficult section, I would take over for a while. When her spirits flagged during morning sickness, we would knit and talk about the child she was carrying." Elijah tried to imagine this scene, his mother and grandmother together, creating something for him before he even existed in the world. The image created an ache of longing for what he couldn't remember. "The blue trim was my addition," Margaret continued. "In many cultures, blue is a protective color. I knitted it while praying for your safety and happiness." Her fingers trembled as they followed the trim's path. "I never imagined how much protection you would need, or how completely I would fail to provide it." "You didn't fail," Elijah said firmly. "The system failed. Circumstances failed. Not you." Margaret's eyes, though clouded with medication, held his with surprising intensity. "Perhaps, but what matters is that the blanket stayed with you. Through everything, every home, every disruption, it remained. As though some part of our love traveled with you, even when we couldn't." She nodded toward the envelope in the box. "I've written the full story there, along with other things I wanted to make sure you knew. About your mother, your grandfather, our family." Elijah took the envelope but didn't open it. "You can tell me yourself when you're stronger." The look Margaret gave him was gentle but unflinching. "We both know that isn't likely, dear heart." Tears blurred Elijah's vision, but he nodded, acknowledging the truth they'd been dancing around. "I don't want to say goodbye." "Then don't," Margaret said simply. "Say I love you instead. It's far more important." "I love you," Elijah whispered, the words coming easily despite having been foreign to his vocabulary for most of his life. "And I love you," Margaret replied, her voice strengthening with the declaration. "I have loved you every day since I first held you as a newborn. I loved you through 13 years of searching, and I will love you long after I'm gone from this earth." She reached for the blanket, lifting it with effort. "This blanket isn't just wool and thread, Elijah. It's tangible love, created by your mother's hands and mine, preserved through years of separation, and returned to me through an act of kindness that defied all odds." Margaret held the blanket out to him. "Take it. It belongs with you. And whenever you wrap yourself in it, know that you're surrounded by the love of the women who made it. Your mother and me." Elijah took the blanket, burying his face in its soft folds to hide the tears now flowing freely. It smelled faintly of Margaret's apartment, chamomile tea and the lavender sachets she kept in her dresser drawers. But beneath that, some deeply buried part of him recognized an older scent, one that whispered of safety and belonging. They sat together through the afternoon, Margaret drifting in and out of sleep while Elijah read aloud from the book she loved. As evening approached, her breathing grew more labored, each inhale a visible effort. The night nurse suggested Elijah take a break, get some proper rest, but something in Margaret's expression made him refuse. He stayed, holding her hand, the blanket draped across both their laps, a bridge between past and present. Near midnight, Margaret woke suddenly, her eyes clearer than they had been in days. "Elijah," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "Promise me something." "Anything," he replied without hesitation. "Promise me you'll live fully," she said. "Not just survive. Live with an open heart even though it risks breaking. Love fearlessly. Help strangers. Look for magic in ordinary moments." Elijah swallowed hard. I promise. Margaret nodded, satisfied. And when you have children someday, if you choose to, tell them about their great-grandmother who searched for 13 years to find their father. Tell them our story. I will. Elijah vowed, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret's eyes drifted past him, focusing on something only she could see. Rebecca, she whispered, you're here. A calm seemed to settle over her then, a peacefulness that smoothed the lines of pain from her face. Her breathing slowed, became less labored. Elijah held her hand through the night, the blanket wrapped around both of them, as Margaret slipped gradually away from him and toward whatever waited beyond. Near dawn, with the first light touching the hospital window, she took one final breath and was gone. In the stillness that followed, Elijah sat motionless, still holding her hand. The gray blanket with blue trim, a tangible connection to all he had lost and found and lost again. Grief pressed against his chest like a physical weight, yet beneath it pulsed something unexpected. Gratitude. For 6 precious months, he had known what it meant to belong to someone, to be loved unconditionally, to have family. The blanket that had traveled with him through 13 years of loneliness had led him home, if only briefly. And though that home was now gone, Elijah knew with bone-deep certainty that he carried it within him, just as he would carry Margaret's love, her stories, her amber eyes that looked back at him from every mirror. Outside the hospital window, the sun rose on his first day without his grandmother, painting the sky in shades of promise. Elijah Walker, no longer just an orphan, but a young man with a history, a legacy, and a future, wrapped the blanket around his shoulders and faced the dawn. In his pocket rested Margaret's letter, waiting to be read. In his heart burned a promise to live as she had asked, fully, fearlessly, with kindness towards strangers who might, in ways he couldn't yet imagine, become as significant as family. And in his hands the blanket remained, a tangible reminder that love, once created, never truly disappears. It simply changes form, traveling across time and circumstance, connecting those separated by life's cruelest accidents, waiting for the moment when kindness opens the door to recognition, to reunion, to the healing that only love can provide. For Elijah Walker, that healing had begun on a cold December night with a simple act, an orphan donating his blanket to a shivering woman who would become his heart's true home.